Welcome to Salaam, Shalom, Report on Palestine, Israel. I'm Marc Hage. This show is a production of Vermonters for Justice in Palestine. To learn more about the work of the organization, including our leadership of an international campaign calling on Ben & Jerry's to stop selling its peace and love ice cream in illegal Jewish-only settlements in occupied Palestine, please visit our extensive website at vtjp.org. Our webmaster is Ian Stokes. We open tonight with a presentation by Dr. Marc Lamont Hill, a professor at Temple University, also a social activist, and until recently, a media commentator. On November 28th, the International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, Dr. Hill addressed the General Assembly of the United Nations. He spoke out unequivocally in support of the Palestinian national liberation struggle, and his opposition was expressed in no uncertain terms to Israel's policies of military occupation, settler colonialism, forced displacement, and institutional racism. Dr. Hill reminded his diplomatic audience that 2018 is the 70th anniversary of what the Palestinian people call El Nakba, the catastrophe of 1948. It was during this period when approximately 750,000 Palestinians were forcibly driven from their ancestral homeland by Israeli Jewish militias and terrorist gangs. Hundreds of Palestinian villages, towns, and urban neighborhoods were ethnically cleansed and destroyed. 2018 is also the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which Hill references liberally in his comments. Hill's presentation is also memorable because he calls attention to a large body of Israeli laws and social policies that are designed to deliberately discriminate against the non-Jewish citizens of Israel, notably its Palestinian citizens, who make up approximately 20% of Israel's population. According to Hill, at the current moment, there are more than 60 Israeli laws that deny Palestinians access to full citizenship rights, simply because they're not Jewish. From housing to education to family reunification, it is clear that any freedoms naturally endowed to all human beings are actively being stripped away from Palestinians through Israeli statecraft, end quote. Hill also underscored that American tax dollars and political support are absolutely vital to Israel's maintenance of its institutional system of racism and to its occupation of occupied Palestinian lands. In response to this speech, Hill faced a barrage of criticism on social media and from mainstream media outlets. He was also promptly fired by CNN as a media commentator. Here now is Dr. Marc Lamont Hill addressing the United Nations General Assembly on November 28th.
Mr. Secretary General, Chairman, Ambassadors, and Your Excellencies, good afternoon. It is with great honor and humility that I accept the opportunity to speak before you. As a scholar, as an activist, and as a citizen, I am profoundly interested in the plight of the Palestinian people, as well as the broader ethical, moral, and political implications of their struggle for freedom and justice, as well as equality. As such, this annual convening represents a critical intervention. It also represents a site of possibility. On the other hand, it shows considerable irony. As you well know, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration is produced out of the rubble and contradictions of World War II, and it was intended to offer a clear ethical and moral outline of the basic rights and freedoms to which all human beings, irrespective of race, religion, class, gender, or geography, are entitled. This declaration, of course, has been far from perfect, both in design and in execution. Too often we have framed human rights through the lens of the West. We've viewed it through the gaze of colonialism, and we have assessed them through the limited prism of our own experiences. Simply put, the powerful have too often attempted to universalize their own particular and local values. Still, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has offered us a flawed but functional starting point from which to articulate basic moral and ethical ambitions as global citizens. These ambitions have been particularly helpful when attempting to keep track of the vulnerable against the backdrop of imperialism, exploitative economic arrangements, white supremacy, patriarchy, and all the other entanglements of the modern nation state. For this reason, it is indeed ironic and sad that this year also marks the 70th anniversary of the Nakba, the great catastrophe in May 1948 that resulted in the expulsion, murder, and to date, permanent dislocation of more than 1 million Palestinians. For every minute that the global community has articulated a clear and lucid framework for human rights, the Palestinian people have been deprived of the most fundamental of them. While the Universal Declaration for Human Rights says that all people are, quote, born free and equal in dignity and rights, the Israeli nation state continues to restrict freedom and undermine equality for Palestinian citizens of Israel, as well as those in the West Bank and Gaza. At the current moment, there are more than 60 Israeli laws that deny Palestinians access to full citizenship rights, simply because they're not Jewish. From housing to education to family reunification, it is clear that any freedoms naturally endowed to all human beings are actively being stripped away from Palestinians through Israeli statecraft. While human rights promises the right to life, liberty, and security of person, Palestinians continue to live under the threat of random violence by Israeli military and police, disproportionate violence within the West Bank and Gaza, unprompted violence in the face of peaceful protest, and misdirected violence by an Israeli state that systematically fails to distinguish between civilians and combatants. While the Universal Declaration for Human Rights protects us against torture and cruel and inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, Palestinians continue to be physically and psychologically tortured by the Israeli criminal justice system, a term I can only use with irony. As human rights groups around the world have noted, the use of solitary confinement constitutes a clear and indisputable form of torture. Yet in the West Bank, Palestinians are routinely subjected to solitary confinement and indefinite detention, often without any formal charges being filed. Last year, the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that physical torture in, quote, exceptional cases, including ticking time bomb situations, constitute acceptable means by which to engage in torture. Although these exceptions are themselves a violation of the absolute human right not to be tortured, Israeli security operates in practice in such a way that nearly all Palestinian cases are viewed as exceptional. Nearly every Palestinian is understood to be a potential terrorist, thereby making them susceptible to ticking time bomb investigation tactics at all times. As such, Israel's practices are routinely in clear violation of the UN's Convention on Torture, which was signed by Israel in 1986 and ratified in 1991. While the Declaration of Human Rights insists that no one be subjected to arbitrary arrest, detention, or exile, Palestinians are routinely denied due process of law. West Bank Palestinians are regularly placed under administrative detention, a framework that allows them to be incarcerated for up to 6 months and can be extended after judicial review without being charged with a crime. The only thing needed for such outcomes is the ambiguous claim of a security threat, a claim used by the Israeli state at all times, at all costs, and for all reasons. Through this vagueness, Palestinians are routinely punished for their political views rather than any actual threat of violence. The Declaration of Human Rights insists that all humans are entitled to a, quote, fair and public hearing by an impartial tribunal. Israeli military courts, the exclusive adjudicator largely for West Bank residents, and in some cases Palestinian citizens of Israel, they have a conviction rate of more than 99%. That suggests that Palestinians are either more guilty than any other group in human history, or that the Israeli government is unwilling or incapable of offering fair and impartial trials for Palestinians. Declaration of Human Rights promises the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state, as well as the right to leave any country, including his, own, and to return to said country. It is impossible to travel throughout historic Palestine and not see the blatant restriction of movement between cities in the occupied Palestinian territories, as well as inside the state of Israel. Standing checkpoints, temporary or flying checkpoints, annexation walls and other security barriers prevent Palestinians from moving freely, both within areas legally designated by the Israeli government and co-signed by the Palestinian Authority under the terms of Oslo. But also we see in Gaza the restriction of movement that is so severe that it literally defines life in the area. I promise you that I will not exhaust all of my time by enumerating every human rights violation perpetrated by the Israeli government. These are well known and have been well documented by every credible human rights organization in the world. Rather, I would like to speak to you about the urgency of the current moment. Forgive my thirst. I literally just got off of a flight from Palestine to come to address you this morning, and I was boycotting the Israeli water, so I was unable to quench my thirst. But thank you for your indulgence, or for indulging me, rather. As we speak, the conditions on the ground for Palestinian people are worsening. In recent decades, the Israeli government has moved further and further to the right, normalizing settler colonialism and its accompanying logics of denial, destruction, displacement, and death. Despite international condemnation, settlement expansion has continued. At the same time, home demolitions and state-enforced displacement continues to uproot Palestinian communities. For Gazans, the 11-year Israeli and Egyptian blockade by land, air, and sea has created the largest open-air prison in the world. With only 4% potable water, electricity access that is limited to 4 hours per day, 50% unemployment, and the looming threat of Israeli bombs, Gaza continues to constitute one of the most pressing humanitarian crises of the current moment. In the West Bank, conditions are not much better. Unemployment is generally around 18%, with frequent loss of income due to Israeli military closures, making it impossible for Palestinian workers to get access to jobs. Settlements and the extra land allocated for them, as well as closed military zones and other restrictions, make it impossible for Palestinian towns to grow. And in the midst of it all, Prime Minister Netanyahu's administration has become increasingly indifferent to critique, censure, or even scorn from the international community for its practices. Perhaps the most glaring example of this indifference, as well as the urgency of the current moment, is the recently passed nation-state law. Through this basic law, the Israeli state has officially rejected Arabic as an official state language. It has described settlement expansion, both inside and outside of the Green Line, as a national value, and it has reinforced the fact that Israel is not a state of all of its citizens. As an American, I am embarrassed that my tax dollars contribute to this reality. I am frustrated that no American president since the start of the occupation has taken a principled and actionable position in defense of Palestinian rights. And I am saddened, though not surprised, that President Trump's administration has further emboldened Israel's behavior through its recent actions. In May of this year, President Trump officially moved the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, which he recognized as the undivided capital of Israel. This choice not only flew in the face of international law and precedent, but also constituted a powerful provocation and a diplomatic death blow. In late August, President Trump then permanently reneged on America's commitment to funding UNRWA, a move that now leaves millions of Palestinian refugees in medical, economic, and educational peril. Moreover, the move serves as a political strong-arm tactic, whereby the United States is unilaterally attempting to resolve, through the Trump administration, the final status of Palestinian refugees. While President Trump's policies have been the most dramatic, it is important that I stress to you, to reiterate to you, that they are not wildly out of step with American policy. Cuts to UNRWA is an idea that has been raised in Washington for years, dating back at least to the George W. Bush administration. President Trump's decision to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem caused enormous controversy, but he was merely implementing a bipartisan law Congress passed in 1995. And in so doing, he executed what has already been official United States policy and the fulfillment of a promise made by every United States president and presidential candidate, Democrat and Republican, for a very long time. With regard to the question of Palestine, Donald Trump is not an exception to American policy. Rather, Donald Trump is a more transparent and aggressive iteration of it. As I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, the words offered today by everyone in this room are a necessary component of our resistance efforts. We need powerful, counterintuitive, dangerous, and courageous words. But we must also offer more than just words. Words will not stop the village of Khan al-Ahmar with its makeshift schools created by local Bedouin villagers. Words will not stop them from being demolished in violation of the Fourth Geneva Conventions. Words will not stop poets like Darin Tetur from being caged in Israeli jails, for having the audacity to speak the truth about the conditions of struggle on her own personal Facebook page. Words will not stop peaceful protesters in Gaza from being killed as they fight for freedom against Israel's still undeclared borders. Regarding the question of Palestine, beyond words, we must ask the question, what does justice require? To truly engage in acts of solidarity, we must make our words flesh. Our solidarity must be more than a noun. Our solidarity must become a verb. As a Black American, my understanding of action and solidarity action is rooted in our own tradition of struggle. As Black Americans resisted slavery, as well as Jim Crow laws that transformed us from a slave state to an apartheid state, we did so through multiple tactics and strategies. It is this array of tactics that I appeal to as I advocate for concrete action from all of us in this room. Solidarity from the international community demands that we embrace boycotts, divestment, and sanctions as a critical means by which to hold Israel accountable for its treatment of Palestinian people. This movement, which emerges out of the overwhelming majority of Palestinian civil society, offers a nonviolent means by which to demand a return to the pre-67 borders, full rights for Palestinian citizens, and the right of return as dictated by international law. Solidarity demands that we no longer allow politicians or political parties to remain silent on the question of Palestine. We can no longer, in particular, allow the political left to remain radical or even progressive on every issue, from the environment to war to the economy, to remain progressive on every issue except for Palestine. Contrary to Western mythology, Black resistance to American apartheid did not come purely through Gandhian nonviolence. Rather, slave revolts and self-defense and tactics otherwise divergent from Dr. King or Mahatma Gandhi were equally important to preserving safety and attaining freedom. We must allow, if we are to operate in true solidarity with Palestinian people, we must allow the Palestinian people the same range of opportunity and political possibility. If we are standing in solidarity with Palestinian people, we must recognize the right of an occupied people to defend itself. We must prioritize peace. But we must not romanticize or fetishize it. We must advocate and promote nonviolence at every opportunity, but we cannot endorse a narrow politics of respectability that shames Palestinians for resisting, for refusing to do nothing in the face of state violence and ethnic cleansing. At the current moment, there is little reason for optimism. Optimism, of course, is the belief that good will inevitably prevail over evil, that justice will inevitably win out. In the course of human history, and certainly even in the course of the United Nations, there is no evidence of such a proposition. Optimism is unsophisticated. Optimism is immature. Optimism is what my students have when they take examinations that they did not study for. Some become quite religious at that time. But regardless of their strategies of optimism, the outcome is far from guaranteed or even likely. What I'm challenging us to do in the spirit of solidarity is not to embrace optimism, but to embrace radical hope. Radical hope is a belief that despite the odds, despite the considerable measures against justice and peace, despite the legacy of hatred and imperialism and white supremacy and patriarchy and homophobia, despite these systems of power that have normalized settler colonialism, despite these structures, we can still win, we can still prevail. One motivation for my hope in the liberation and ultimate self-determination of the Palestinian people comes in August of 2014. Black Americans were in Ferguson, Missouri, in the Midwest of the United States, protesting the death of a young man named Michael Brown, an unarmed African-American male who had been killed by a law enforcement agent. And as we protested, I saw two things that provided hope for the Palestinian struggle. One was that for the first time in my entire life of activism, I saw a sea of Palestinian people. I saw a sea of Palestinian flags in the crowd saying that we must form a solidarity project. We must struggle together in order to resist, because state violence in the United States and state violence in Brazil and state violence in Syria and state violence in Egypt and state violence in South Africa and state violence in Palestine are all of the same sort. And we finally understood that we must work together and not turn on each other, but instead turn to each other. And later that night, when the police began to tear gas us, Miriam Barghouti tweeted us from Ramallah. She, along with other Palestinian youth activists, told us that the tear gas that we were experiencing was only temporary. They gave us tips for how to wash our eyes out. They told us how to make gas masks out of T-shirts. They gave us permission to think and dream beyond our local conditions by giving us a transnational or a global solidarity project. And from those tweets and social media messages, we began then to organize together. We brought a delegation of black activists to Palestine, and we saw the connections between the police in New York City, who were being trained by Israeli soldiers, and the type of policing we were experiencing in New York City. We began to see relationships of resistance, and we began to build and struggle and organize together. That spirit of solidarity, a solidarity that is bound up not just in ideology, but in action, is the way out. So as we stand here on the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the tragic commemoration of the Nakba, we have an opportunity to not just offer solidarity in words, but to commit to political action, grassroots action, local action, and international action that will give us what justice requires. And that is a free Palestine from the river to the sea.
Our next two reports were produced by Al Jazeera. The first features journalist Dina Takruri visiting the small village of Nabi Saleh in the occupied West Bank, where she visited Ahmed Tamimi, a young Palestinian activist, and others like her who, along with their families and friends, have been leading a nonviolent, sustained campaign of resistance against Israeli military rule and the theft of their lands for more than a decade. Here now is Dina Takruri.
Nabi Saleh, a tiny village in the occupied West Bank that has been waging a sustained unarmed resistance movement against Israel's military rule.
يعني هو طخ نهار من هان ظلت كسرت كل شيء ووقفت هان.
This is the birthplace of Ahad Tamimi, the Palestinian teenager who confronted armed Israeli soldiers in front of her house and served 8 months in prison. Her slap reverberated around the world, catapulting her into the international spotlight as a symbol of Palestinian resistance.
The normal answer for the Israeli occupation is to slap them.
She's blonde, with curly hair, with colored eye. That's why her case went worldwide.
In the days leading up to her release, I came to Nabi Saleh to learn Ahad's backstory. And to experience for myself daily life in this village, which is being choked by an illegal Israeli settlement and which suffers regular violence from the occupation forces. I wanted to hear what lies ahead for the young generation of Palestinians growing up under an occupation with no end in sight.
فكرك تقدر تعيش بسلام مع المستوطنين اللي عايشين هناك؟
مش عيش بسلام طالما هم مع أرضنا.
We're in the Palestinian town of Nabi Saleh in the occupied West Bank, where Ahad Tamimi grew up. And right across the road over there is the illegal Israeli settlement of Halamish. And the presence of those settlers and the many soldiers deployed here to protect them has made life for villagers in Nabi Saleh a living hell. These are regular scenes in Nabi Saleh. Israeli soldiers firing tear gas, skunk water, rubber-coated steel bullets, and even live ammunition, while unarmed Palestinians marched carrying flags and banners and sometimes throwing stones. For the past decade, the villagers have led a popular nonviolent resistance movement to protest the Israeli settlers' creeping confiscation of their land and resources. This resistance campaign began in 2009 after settlers took control of a natural spring that's owned by one of the elders in the village. The Tamimi family traces its roots back to Nabi Saleh for hundreds of years. More than 500 people live here, most of them extended family. Across the road, the Israeli settlement of Halamish was created in 1977. It's one of more than 200 settlements in the West Bank built on occupied Palestinian land in violation of international law. Before you can even enter Nabi Saleh, you have to pass by the settlement and an army base to protect it. An army observation balloon with cameras monitors the village at all times. International law allows Palestinians to resist occupation, even via armed struggle within the bounds of the laws of armed conflict. The villagers of Nabi Saleh have chosen a non-violent path, but the army's response has been anything but non-violent. Ahad's life changed on December 15th, the day her 15-year-old cousin Muhammad was shot in the head at close range by an Israeli soldier.
احكي لي وين بالضبط طخك وين دخلت الرصاص؟
يعني هو طخني هان من هان ظلت كسرت كل شيء ووقفت هان هي. يعني هذه قطمتها العضلة هذه قطمتها.
His injuries were so severe, he had to be put into a medically induced coma, and he lost an entire part of his skull.
احكي لي عن يوم ما تصوبت انت، شو تتذكر؟ شو صار؟
يعني كان في مواجهات في البلد يوم ما أعلن ترامب إنه الكل بدهم ينقلوا على القدس. كنا يعني في الفيلا هاي اللي تصوبت فيها. كنا نلعب في فوتبول. فكان صوت الجيش قربوا على الفيلا. يعني في اثنين كانوا معي هربوا. طلعوا عن السور هربوا. طلعت عن السور ووقفت أنا بدي أشوف إذا دخلوا ولا لا فاتوا على الفيلا. لو كان متخبي بده يسقط ولد ولا حدا. كانوا متخبين. يعني أول ما طلع علي يعني أول ما شافني طخني إياها. لما صحيت في الاستشاري كنت موفى 17 يوم أنا في العناية.
أغمى عليك يعني؟
وكانت المطاطة يعني واصلة عن الدماغ سنتي بعيد عن الدماغ. يعني لو مشي شوي يعني استشهدت.
حياتك تغيرت؟
حياتي تغيرت عن أشياء كثير في البلد. يعني بطلت ألعب فوتبول، بطلت يعني أروح مع الأولاد أجري، بطلت يعني أجي هنا أكل أشياء تين أكل لوز. يعني بقدرش بخاف على حالي أغمى أدوخ يصير لي شي لما أوقع. بخاف من أشياء كثيرة في البلد.
Hours after Muhammad was shot, Ahad confronted 2 armed soldiers in front of her family's house. The incident was filmed and shared on social media by her mother, Neriman, who would later be arrested and charged with incitement. Millions around the world were captivated by the image of a young girl showing no fear as she hits out at heavily armed soldiers. 4 days after, Israeli soldiers came to her house in the middle of the night and arrested her. While filming around Nabi Saleh, we were stopped several times by various Israeli soldiers.
So they just told us we're not allowed to film that either.
And we were stopped by a guard for the settlement.
What are we allowed to film?
Not the issue, not the settlement.
Not the settlements?
No, you can photos there in Nabi Saleh, free.
Okay. Is that a law?
Is it a law? Yes.
It is a law.
It's the law that written in the Torah.
Oh, in the Torah?
Torah.
Oh, okay, so we're following the law of the Torah. So no filming
Yes,
the
yes.
settlements.
No, and
No.
don't photo me.
Okay.
Don't take a picture of me.
All right.
A few miles outside of Nabi Saleh, Israeli soldiers threw a stun grenade at us for filming around a checkpoint.
Okay, all right. Put the camera down. I don't speak Hebrew. I'm an American. Okay.
Like elsewhere in the West Bank, childhood for the youth of Nabi Saleh is anything but normal. For many here, it's not a matter of if they'll get arrested, but when. Because of that, the adults in the village organize regular training sessions where they simulate the experience of getting arrested, detained, and interrogated to teach the children their rights and what to expect. During her hours-long interrogation, Hage remained silent, refusing even to say her name. As many as 700 Palestinian children under the age of 18 from the occupied West Bank are prosecuted every year through Israeli military courts. They're not accompanied by a parent and are often interrogated without a lawyer or being informed of their right to silence. Over the last 3 years, the Palestinian child prisoner population has doubled. Hage's first cousin, 11-year-old Samir, became known as Spider-Man because he regularly dressed up as his favorite comic book hero during the weekly marches. He liked how Spider-Man helped people and thought wearing his costume would give him special powers. I asked him what happened to his eye.
كانوا الجيش جايين عبيتنا الصبح وكان في مواجهات ولما طلع رمى رصاص الكناهن وقعدنا نلعب فيهن انفجرت في رصاصة.
انفجرت في ايدك؟ وبعدين شو صار؟
طلع الشظية جت عند عيني وفي صبعي.
There are so many remnants of tear gas and sound bomb canisters left behind by Israeli soldiers. Samir's family hung them up in front of the entrance of their home. His mother Manal told me why.
We want to show people who's coming that all these kind of weapons, it's used against us for adopting nonviolent resistance.
Manal says she's been injured countless times during the village's protests, one time even getting shot in the leg with a live bullet. And she's been arrested 3 times. The last time was during a women's sit-in outside the military court at one of Israel's prisons, 1 week after Hage was arrested.
That was the worst experience because the minute they arrested me, they took me back behind the guard room and they attacked me. They began to kick me and beating me with their legs and their rifles. I didn't have any medical treatment, so after 2 days, my face, it was like this.
Why did they hit you when you were arrested the last time?
Without any reason.
Just days after she was released, Israeli soldiers arrested her teenage son Muhammad from their home. And like Hage's arrest, it happened in the middle of the night. I asked Manal why they arrested him.
Throwing stones. It's the typical charges. When they can't find evidence against one of the youth or The typical thing is throwing stones, and they will have 1 or 2 or 10 soldiers as eyewitness.
Stone throwing is the most common charge levied against Palestinian children and is punishable by up to 20 years in prison under Israeli military law. After being arrested, children are taken to interrogation, where they're often tied at the hands and feet, denied food and water, and are physically and verbally abused. Manal says her son Muhammad's interrogation was so severe, it nearly broke him.
He was kept in interrogation center called Betahtikva, which is one of the worst interrogation center inside the 48, and the cells are underground. He's not allowed to see anybody. He went from 5 in the morning until 10 at night every day.
Being interrogated?
Being interrogated. The room were lighted 24/7. He's not allowed to have a shower to change his clothes. So for 25 days he couldn't take a shower or anything. Only small meals of smashed potato, like 1 spoon of smashed potato to keep him alive, actually.
Muhammad's brother Osama, who was arrested 10 days after him, was forced to watch his brother's interrogation, a form of psychological torture.
How do you feel as a mother having 2 sons in Israeli prison right now?
It's awful. The worst nightmare that any mother could go through, that to know that her children or her sons taking the sequences of a decision she took. When I took the decision to participate in the nonviolent resistance, I knew that at one point my children gonna be punished.
Israel's occupation, which is more than half a century old and with no end in sight, puts Palestinians in the West Bank under Israeli military law and a system that denies them the legal rights of citizens. Israeli settlers living in the same territory have full democratic rights and are governed by Israeli civilian law. That means a Palestinian and an Israeli settler can commit the same exact crime, but be tried in different courts with different outcomes. Under the military court system, Palestinians face a conviction rate higher than 99%. This dual and discriminatory legal system has been denounced by many in the international community as exemplifying apartheid.
As part of the preparations for Ahad and her mom's return home, they're about to raise a Palestinian flag right now.
I wanted to visit their home to see how the rest of the family was doing, with half of its members imprisoned by Israel. Ahad's older brother Waad has also been in jail since May, serving an 18-month sentence for throwing stones. Her father Basim is one of the leaders of the grassroots resistance here. He's been arrested by Israel several times and was tortured in jail.
You guys filmed Ahad as she slapped the soldier, and you decided to publish the video knowing very well that she might be arrested, she might go to prison. Why did you do that?
We are a freedom fighter. We are not a victim. For that, yes, I know that she will be. And we know that she will be arrested. But we believe that it's our part of our duty and responsibility to encourage our population and our society and our people that everyone can do something.
Knowing that she went to jail because of the video, do you regret publishing it?
If it's returned, I will publish it another time.
You would do it again?
Yes, I will do it again. It's part of our strategy to build the belief of nonviolent resistance and to show the world our message. And if we struggle, we must be ready to pay the price. Without freedom and without justice and dignity, there is no life. Ahad slapped the soldier. This is a normal react. It's a normal way. Not to slap the soldier is abnormal.
Why do you say that it's normal?
The normal answer for the Israeli occupation is to slap them. The normal way to deal with our enemy is just by resistance. And I think everyone in the world, every parent would like their daughter to be strong like Ahad, not to be broken in front of an armed man.
In the meantime, the emotional scars left on his children are evident. Basim says his son Muhammad, nicknamed Abu Yazan, copes with the absence of his mother, sister, and brother by telling himself that they're just away on vacation.
I ask him, all the time asking, why you don't ask? He said, I convinced myself that they are traveling outside. I don't want to think.
He's in denial.
Oh, yeah.
But that's not where the trauma for these children ends. Earlier this year, Samer witnessed his 21-year-old cousin, Izzeddin Tamimi, get shot and killed in his backyard by an Israeli soldier. The following footage is graphic.
كان يوم صبح السبعة كانوا أهلي طالعين على شغلهم وفيش غير أنا وأختي وبنت عمتي وكنت بدي أروح على دار سيدي هناك أمن لي وأنا نازل هجم الجنود جري رجعت على بيتنا كنت شايف في إشي على الأرض بس ما عرفت شو هو بعديها طلعت على ظهر بيتنا شفناهم بضربوا في حدا طلعنا شفنا إنه عز مطخوخ وبضربوا فيه.
شفته وهو بضربوا فيه؟ شو شفت؟
شفتهم بضربوا فيه في رجليهم على بطنه وعلى ظهره وعلى راسه.
خفت لما شفت شو صار له؟
خفت كثير أول إشي لأنه منظر مش طبيعي إنه نشوف واحد مستشهد. أيام برضه خفت لأنه أهلي ما كانوا في البيت عنا والجيش مش مخليني أنزل على دار سيدي.
Israeli soldiers left Iz bleeding for 30 minutes before eventually transferring him to a military vehicle. Once there, he was held for another 15 minutes without medical attention.
We want them to take him to the hospital!
The soldiers then surrendered him to an ambulance, but it was all too late. The trauma that children like Samer witness is even apparent in the games they play.
The only thing they are saying, the brutality of the soldiers, the suffering of their families. They saw their family got injured, got arrested. They are thinking this is the normal life that we are living. You will see them either playing soldiers, Palestinian and soldiers, throwing stones at each other, or playing like now, Samer, he was playing with Watan, handcuffed him, like he's the weakest person here, and so he's like Palestinian, we can arrest him or we can handcuff him.
Ahed's story has cast a spotlight on a new generation of Palestinian youth, their plight, their hopes, and their increasing influence in the resistance against Israel's rule over them. It's a generation with less loyalty to the different political factions and growing disenchantment with the Palestinian Authority, whose security forces have coordinated closely with Israel for more than 2 decades.
What do you think Ahed's generation will accomplish that your generation wasn't able to?
I think we are the generation of the first Intifada, and we do our duty and our responsibility. We succeed partially, but I think this generation will be able to make a big change. They do what they believe. Nobody controls them and said it's okay or not okay. They are more free.
12-year-old Salaam is Ahed's youngest brother.
شو أكثر إشي في حياتك تحلم فيه؟
الحرية.
شو معنى الحرية؟
إشي كثير كبير. يعني معناه يعني أنا بلعب بس مرات بيجوا بخربوا. يعني بصير أروح واجي بسرعة مش هم يعوقوا علي ويعني بس أطلع أسافر يحجزوني.
مين هم؟
الجيش.
While Ahed's incarceration made international headlines, it is not unique. Last year, Israel arrested 1,467 Palestinian minors. And there are currently around 60 Palestinian females in Israeli prison, many of whom have longer and harsher sentences than Ahed. The lack of attention other prisoners get is a reality that Ahed's own family members acknowledge.
Ahed has captivated the world partly because she is a woman. She's a female.
She's a female, not wearing hijab. She's blonde, with curly hair, with colored eye. So she's the best example for the European and Western girl. That's why her case went worldwide in the time that there are Palestinian female minors lying under very bad situation. But nobody care about this because they're not blonde. We still suffer from white privilege and discrimination.
As the hours count down for Hage and her mother's return home, the future for this village and for the Palestinian people remains grim.
It's been almost a decade since you guys started your marches and protest, and during these past years, you've lost so many relatives. They've lost their lives or they've been in jail. Do you think it was worth it, and was it the right strategy?
It's not easy after 70 years of occupation to keep asking for your right. We are not, because we are the owner of this land, and we are the resident of this land, and this is our history in this land, and our duty and responsibility to resist.
أنت من الجيل الجديد، شو بتتمنى لحياتك؟
إنها فلسطين ترضى حرية، إحنا نتعلم، ندرس في الجامعات، نشتغل. يعني تصير كل البلاد عندنا زي برا. يعني برا يعني عندهم كل شيء. يعني مش محتلين أشياء.
إنه تتحرر فلسطين ونعيش بسلام ونقدر نتنقل من المدن والدول بلا حواجز من إسرائيل.
فكرك تقدر تعيش بسلام مع المستوطنين اللي عايشين هناك؟
مش عيش بسلام طالما هم مع أرضنا.
Hey guys, it's Dina, and that's Life in Nabi Saleh. Make sure you check out part 2 of this series, which is the day of Hage Tamimi's release and my one-on-one interview with her. Please make sure to like and share this video and subscribe to AJ+.
The BDS movement, the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign against the State of Israel and its military occupation was launched in 2005. And since that time, it has scored a number of very important political victories. What I'd like to do now is to review some of the biggest accomplishments of the movement this year, 2018, and we'll start with a report from Massachusetts and Vermont. The city of Northampton, Massachusetts, and Vermont State Police, under political pressure, decided to pull out of a planned training junket in Israel where they were to meet with Israeli military and police officials. Senators Bernie Sanders of Vermont and Dianne Feinstein of California sent a letter to Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell in the Senate calling on them to withdraw support for an anti-BDS piece of legislation called the Israeli Anti-Boycott Act. Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib became the first sitting U.S. members of Congress to actively support the BDS movement. Airbnb announced that it would no longer be listing sightings or making a profit from illegal settlement homes in occupied Palestine. Argentina's national football team withdrew from an exhibition match in Israel. Singer Lana Del Rey became one of 19 artists to withdraw from Israel's Meteor Festival, and Shakira and Lorde were among other top artists who refused to perform in Israel in 2018. Chile's Congress overwhelmingly voted to ban any products produced in Israel's illegal settlements. Major organizations from the Indian women's movement, representing more than 10 million women, endorsed the BDS movement and demanded the release of all Palestinian child prisoners. Amnesty International called again for an arms embargo against Israel, and the United Kingdom Labour Party voted to freeze arms sales to Israel. A minister of state and 50 Irish lawmakers called on Ireland to stop arming Israel. Several cities in Italy and in Spain called for an arms embargo as well against the Jewish state. The Black Lives Matter movement called for the United States to terminate $38 billion in military funding to the State of Israel, and in Scotland, the Falkirk Pension Fund divested from a major Israeli bank. Parliamentarians from Spain and Portugal denounced Israel's racist Jewish nation-state law, and 40 international Jewish social justice organizations recognize that the BDS movement has a proven commitment, quote, to fighting anti-Semitism and all forms of racism and bigotry. A 2018 Nobel Prize winner in chemistry, Professor George P. Smith, expressed support for the BDS movement and for cutting U.S. military aid to Israel. Adidas stopped sponsoring the Israeli Football Association, which includes teams in illegal Jewish-only settlements. Trade unionists and human rights activists in Tunisia and across the Arab world forced Israel's Zim shipping line to suspend its routes to Tunisia. The Canadian Federation of Students, representing more than 500,000 college students, voted to back the BDS movement. Leeds University became the first such institution in the United Kingdom to divest from firms involved in Israel's arms trade. Quakers became the first church in the United Kingdom to say they will not invest in any company that profits from Israel's occupation. The New York University Student Government Assembly passed a resolution calling on that university to divest from corporations that violate Palestinian human rights. And from South Africa, Nkosi Mandela, a parliamentarian and a grandson of Nelson Mandela, reaffirmed the critical support that BDS is now playing to end Israeli occupation and apartheid. So what is the role of BDS in the future of the Palestine liberation struggle? Why is it critical to that struggle? Why has it engendered so much animosity from ruling elites in Israel and in the United States? These were some of the questions put to Omar Barghouti, a Palestinian activist who was one of the co-founders of the BDS movement. He was interviewed in 2017. Once again, this segment was produced by Al Jazeera.
Throughout history, boycotts have played a decisive role in the struggle against state oppression. The Boston Tea Party, Gandhi's Salt March, and the isolation of apartheid South Africa. Boycotts are a nonviolent way to pressure a government to change its ways by drawing attention to oppressive policies through withholding cooperation. And that's exactly why the Palestinian boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement has been gaining traction worldwide, and particularly on college campuses in the US. I sat down with Omar Barghouti, one of the founders of the BDS movement, to find out how we got here and why BDS is so critical to the Palestinian quest for freedom.
Boycott, divestment, and sanctions is a movement that was launched by the absolute majority of Palestinians in 2005. It calls for Palestinian rights under international law. At a minimum, that means ending the occupation, the military occupation of Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, ending the system of racial discrimination that exists in Israel. As I said, 60 laws discriminate against the non-Jewish, the indigenous population. Palestinians have called for isolating Israel's regime until it recognizes our rights under international law.
Why is the Israeli government trying so hard to discredit and stop BDS?
Israel perceives BDS as having a very serious strategic impact on its entire regime of oppression because Israel, and as well as we do, see the South African president as very important. We see the US civil rights movement and the power of boycotts in that movement in affecting serious change. At the academic level, the cultural level, and increasingly at the economic level, Israel's isolation is increasing around the world. They see the writing on the wall, and so do we.
Is that an observable fact? That statement that Israel's isolation is increasing all over the world?
Absolutely. Why else do you think Israel treats BDS as a strategic threat and allocates hundreds of millions of dollars to fight the movement, using its intelligence services, dictating policy to some governments that they want to punish BDS activists, threatening churches and trade unions and social movements and so on.
Pro-Israeli US lawmakers are seeking to criminally outlaw support for the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Israel. If a proposed bipartisan law is passed, backers of BDS could face up to 20 years in prison and a whopping $1 million fine. Who's most complicit?
The United States government, obviously, the US Congress, are the most complicit. They continue providing Israel with billions and billions of dollars, weapons, protection at the United Nations, preventing any country from taking serious sanctions against Israel.
For decades, in one of the most consistent and steadfast displays of bipartisanship, Democrats and Republicans have united to guarantee Israel keeps receiving more US foreign aid than any other country in the world. Most of it to fund Israel's military, bringing the total to $38 billion over the next 10 years.
Without the US government, Israel would face serious sanctions because of its egregious violations of human rights and international law. So it's not held according to the same standard. Any other state committing equal crimes would be held accountable, but not Israel, because of international complicity.
The US claims they're the leaders of the free world. What is it about the US that specifically prevents them from living up to that reputation when it comes to the freedom of Palestinians?
I wouldn't even put the United States as one monolithic sum, because there's the 1% and there's the military-industrial complex, that's ruling the United States, and then there's the majority of the people in the United States. The majority of the people have no interest in maintaining Israel's apartheid, Israel's military occupation, and Israel's violations. Recent polls by Brookings Institution, for example, have shown that about 60% of Democrats support sanctions against Israel. 46% of all Americans support sanctions against Israel. That's almost half.
This year, the New York State Senate passed comprehensive legislation to ban colleges from using state money to fund any entity that boycotts Israel, to block public funding for student groups that, quote, participate in hate speech, a term that they use for BDS, and to also ban the state from contracting with any organization known to support BDS.
The Center for Constitutional Rights refers to it as the Palestine exception to free speech. Why does that exist in the States?
For many reasons, the most prominent of which is Israel's lobby influence in Congress among elected officials. But Israel can get away with a lot, passing anti-BDS legislation, suppressing free speech related to Palestine, and indeed pushing a McCarthyism of sorts. I mean, it's even worse than the first edition of McCarthyism.
Why is it worse?
They're trying to get people who support BDS imprisoned for 20 years and paying criminal fines up to $1 million. Even during McCarthy's era, they did not have such ridiculous prison terms. So Israel is pushing a McCarthyist agenda. However, it's alienating the liberal mainstream. Now you have the American Civil Liberties Union, the Center for Constitutional Rights, many liberal groups around the United States defending our right to BDS. While Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates regimes have been intensifying their normalization relations with Israel, especially the United Arab Emirates, which is buying billions of dollars worth of security equipment from Israeli companies through US subsidiaries, and the Saudi regime intensifying its normalization. Normalization is also a threat to us, to the Palestinian cause, from Qatar, from Jordan, Egypt, among others. But there's a culprit that's not often mentioned, which is the Palestinian officialdom. It has opened the doors for many Arab regimes to normalize relations with Israel by not objecting to that, by sometimes encouraging that. So we don't just blame Arab regimes, we also blame the Palestinian regime. The Palestinian Authority was established in the Oslo agreements as a subcontractor for the occupation. I mean, that's a fact. It's not a matter of opinion.
Do you think they support stability over the freedom of Palestinian people?
The states are certainly normalizing with Israel. They would like nothing more than to see us disappear off the face of the earth and to have a normal relationship with Israel, the United States, and so on.
Is that an emotional statement, or do you think that's true?
Well, recent developments show that it's not so emotional after all. With what's going on in Al-Aqsa, Palestinian nonviolent protesters being shot down by Israel, being shot and injured and so on, we haven't seen any serious reaction from most Arab governments, especially in the Gulf. With the exception of Kuwait, we have not seen anything. A few years ago, you would have heard at least lip service, something, condemnation or something. Now they're calling on both sides to exercise restraint. What, they're acting like Condoleezza Rice now?
Doesn't that create a false equivalency?
Yeah, it's like telling the rapist and the rape victim, exercise restraint. It's not just immoral, it's beyond immoral.
How do you feel?
I feel a lot of pain, but I'm also optimistic, which is strange. I mean, not many Palestinians I know are optimistic. I remain optimistic because I'm in the midst of a struggle, and I can see the results. If you see the way Israel arrests young Palestinian children in Jerusalem, for example, and the way they treat them, the torture and so on, it's all meant to destroy them psychologically, not just to colonize their minds, that it's hopeless, to make them lesser humans, that you're subhuman, you're relative humans, you're only human in the relative sense. Therefore, you don't deserve full rights, because you're not a full human after all. Since the Nakba, Israel has not just been colonizing our lands, they've been colonizing our minds with hopelessness, telling us that it's impossible to resist. We're so powerful, you just have to give up and live as slaves. Just live with it. So working on hope, working on triggering hope, achieving results that give our people hope is not just something symbolic or emotional or psychological, it's part of our resistance.